People make a quiet but dangerous assumption. When they lie to someone deeply perceptive, they assume that sensitivity means gullibility, that kindness softens awareness, that emotional depth somehow dulls the ability to see clearly. I have watched this play out in real conversations more times than most people would believe. A person delivers a story that sounds complete on the surface. The details are in place. The tone is controlled. The timing feels appropriate. Nothing obvious stands out as wrong. And yet, something shifts in the room that cannot be explained by the words alone. Because what most people listen for is content. But what a perceptive person tracks is alignment. There is a difference between what is said and how it lands, between the structure of a sentence and the state of the person delivering it. You can hear it in the slight delay before an answer, in the way a smile arrives a moment too late, in how confidence subtly tightens when a certain question appears. These are not dramatic signals. They are small, almost invisible inconsistencies that accumulate faster than conscious thought can organize them. I do not think this is some mystical ability, even though people often describe it that way. What looks like intuition is often pattern recognition operating beneath awareness, built over years of paying attention to emotional signals most people ignore. A perceptive person has felt tension, guilt, hesitation, and internal conflict within themselves. And because of that, they recognize the same emotional signatures in others without needing them to be explained. I once observed a situation where someone insisted they were being honest, and on paper, nothing they said could be easily disproven. But their explanation kept expanding beyond what the moment required, each answer adding more detail instead of resolving the question. That is something most people miss. Truth tends to simplify. Deception tends to overcompensate. Not always in obvious ways, but in subtle ones. A story that should take 10 seconds begins to take 30. A simple clarification turns into a layered defense. And while the words continue, something underneath them begins to feel strained. The person listening may not immediately say anything. In fact, they often won't. Not because they do not notice, but because what they notice does not arrive as a clean accusation. It arrives as a disturbance, a quiet sense that something does not fully align. And that is where people misunderstand what is happening. They think that if they are not being confronted, they are not being seen. They assume that if the conversation continues smoothly, their version of reality has been accepted, but what is actually happening is more complex. The perceptive mind is not reacting to one moment. It is collecting data across moments. It is comparing tone to content, behavior to language, presence to explanation. And once a pattern begins to form, it does not disappear simply because the surface remains calm. There is a particular kind of mistake hidden inside this dynamic. It is the belief that managing the surface is enough to control perception, that if the words sound right, the truth can be redirected. But that only works on people who live primarily at the level of words. It does not work on someone who pays attention to what leaks through, because leakage is where reality reveals itself. A controlled sentence can still carry an uncontrolled emotion. A rehearsed explanation can still carry tension that does not belong to honesty. And over time, those small fractures between what is presented and what is felt begin to organize into something recognizable. This is why the initial lie is rarely as invisible as it seems. It may not be called out, it may not be challenged in that moment, but it is registered. It becomes part of a growing internal map that is constantly updating, constantly comparing, constantly asking one quiet question beneath everything else. Does this match or does it not? And once that question has been activated, it does not easily turn off. What most people call intuition often gets dismissed as something vague or emotional, as if it belongs more to imagination than to observation. But in reality, it tends to operate with a precision that is simply harder to articulate in words. A deeply perceptive person is not guessing, they are processing, they are taking in layers of information at once. Not just what is being said, but how it is being said, when it is being said, and what changes in the person saying it the moment a certain topic appears. I have seen this in situations where nothing in the language itself was clearly wrong, yet something in the delivery carried a tension that did not belong to truth. The explanation was smooth, but the body was not. The voice remained steady, but the rhythm shifted, and those shifts, while subtle, are not random. They are patterns. They repeat across people, across situations, across time. And once someone has spent enough time paying attention to those patterns, they stop needing obvious evidence to recognize when something does not align. This is where most misunderstandings begin. Because people assume that if something cannot be immediately proven, it must not be reliable. But perception does not always arrive in the form of proof. Often it arrives as recognition. A person who has experienced hesitation, internal conflict, or emotional concealment in their own life develops a kind of familiarity with those states, and that familiarity becomes a reference point when they encounter the same signals in someone else, even in a slightly different form. There is a sense of knowing that precedes explanation, not certainty in the logical sense, but coherence in the emotional sense. It is the difference between hearing a sentence and feeling the condition behind that sentence, and once that level of awareness is active, it begins to operate continuously, scanning for alignment, comparing what is presented with what is implied, noticing when those two begin to separate. I once watched a conversation where a person insisted they were comfortable, open, and honest, yet every time the discussion approached a certain area, their responses became more structured, more deliberate, almost as if each sentence was being assembled rather than expressed. Most people in that situation focused on the clarity of the words. They heard confidence. They heard consistency. But there was another layer underneath that told a different story, one that had nothing to do with vocabulary and everything to do with regulation. Because when someone is telling the truth, especially about something simple, there is usually a natural flow to their communication. It does not need to be tightly managed. It does not require constant correction or reinforcement. But when someone is maintaining a version of reality that does not fully match what they feel, there is often a subtle increase in control, and control leaves traces. It shows up in timing, in pacing, in the way a person monitors their own expression while speaking. This is why perceptive individuals often notice what others overlook, not because they are searching for flaws, but because they are sensitive to shifts in consistency. They are not just hearing isolated statements. They are observing continuity. They are asking, often without realizing it, whether the emotional tone, the behavioral signals, and the verbal content all belong to the same internal state. And when those elements begin to drift apart, even slightly, it creates a kind of friction that is difficult to ignore once you have learned to recognize it. That friction does not need to be dramatic to be meaningful. In fact, it is often most reliable when it is quiet, when it appears as a slight hesitation, a minor contradiction, a response that feels just a little too prepared for the moment it appears in. What makes this even more complex is that this kind of perception rarely feels like a conclusion. It feels like an ongoing process. It builds over time, across interactions, across small moments that might seem insignificant on their own but become significant when viewed together. A single inconsistency can be dismissed. A repeated pattern becomes harder to explain away, and the mind, even without conscious effort, begins to track those repetitions, begins to organize them into something that resembles understanding, not a dramatic realization, but a quiet clarity that does not require announcement to exist. Deception becomes something far more serious when it stops being about a single false statement and starts interfering with a person's sense of what is real, because at that point, the issue is no longer accuracy. It is stability. Most people think the damage of a lie can be measured by its size, by how significant the information was, or how direct the falsehood appeared, but that is not how it is experienced by someone who is highly perceptive. The real impact begins the moment a person realizes that what they were responding to was not grounded in truth. Because that realization does not stay contained in the present, it moves backward. It reaches into earlier moments and begins to alter their meaning. Conversations that once felt clear become uncertain. Reassurances that once felt genuine begin to feel rehearsed. A memory that once felt safe starts to feel questionable, not because it has changed, but because the context around it no longer holds. And when enough of those shifts accumulate, something deeper begins to destabilize. Not just trust in the other person, but trust in one's own perception. I have seen situations where a single inconsistency did not create immediate conflict, but instead triggered a quiet process of reevaluation that unfolded over time. A person would recall a detail that did not quite fit, then notice another moment that seemed slightly misaligned, and then another, until what once felt like a coherent narrative began to fragment, not dramatically, not all at once, but gradually, in a way that is much harder to detect from the outside. Because externally, the relationship may still appear intact. Conversation continue. Interactions remain polite. But internally, the foundation is shifting. The person is no longer engaging with the present moment alone. They are engaging with a growing sense that what they were given may not have been real to begin with. This is where deception crosses a threshold and becomes betrayal, not because the lie itself was extreme, but because it forced the other person to build emotional meaning around something that was not true. That is a different kind of injury. It is not just being misinformed. It is being led to invest emotionally in a version of reality that cannot be trusted. And once that happens, the mind does not simply correct the error and move on. It begins to question the entire structure that allowed the error to exist. Was that moment sincere? Was that reaction genuine? Was that connection mutual? These questions are not exaggerated responses. They are attempts to reestablish coherence in a system that has lost it. There is a psychological consequence to this that often goes unnoticed by the person who initiated the deception. When reality becomes unstable, the nervous system does not interpret that as a minor inconvenience. It interprets it as a threat, not in the dramatic sense of immediate danger, but in the deeper sense that something essential to safety has been compromised, because trust is not just a social agreement. It is a functional necessity. It allows a person to predict behavior, to relax into interaction, to invest without constant monitoring. When that structure is disrupted, the mind compensates by increasing vigilance. It begins to scan more, question more, replay more. Not because it wants to, but because it no longer feels secure enough not to. What makes this particularly complex for a perceptive individual is that they often sense the misalignment early, before it could be clearly explained, and once the deception becomes undeniable, it does not just confirm that something was wrong. It confirms that they knew something was wrong before they allowed themselves to believe it. That realization can be just as disruptive as the lie itself, because it introduces a second layer of conflict. Not only was reality distorted, but their own internal warning system was overridden, and that creates a deeper form of doubt, one that extends inward as much as it extends outward. This is why the consequences of deception are rarely contained within the moment it is exposed. They extend into how a person interprets past interactions, how they regulate present ones, and how willing they are to engage in future ones. It is not simply a matter of correcting a mistake. It is a process of reconstructing a sense of reality that no longer feels reliable in the way it once did. What happens next is rarely loud, and that is exactly why it is so often misunderstood. Because people tend to associate change with visible reactions, with confrontation, with clear expressions of anger or disappointment. Yet, in this dynamic, the shift does not announce itself in that way. It begins quietly, almost imperceptibly, in the way attention is allocated, in the way energy is distributed, in the way presence is offered or withheld. The person who once engaged fully, who asked questions, who leaned into conversation, who tried to understand and repair, begins to do less of those things. Not abruptly, but gradually, as if something inside them has started to conserve rather than invest. From the outside, this can look like distance, like disinterest, like a loss of warmth, but those interpretations miss the internal process that led to it, because what appears as withdrawal is often the result of accumulated clarity rather than sudden emotion. I have observed this pattern in situations where one person believed everything was still functioning normally, simply because there had been no direct confrontation, no dramatic moment that forced acknowledgement. Yet at the same time, the other person had already begun to reorganize how they related to the connection. They spoke less about themselves, not because they had nothing to share, but because they no longer felt that sharing would be received within a space that honored truth. They responded more briefly, not because they lacked interest, but because they were no longer investing in sustaining a dynamic that had shown signs of misalignment. They stopped asking certain questions, not because they were indifferent, but because they had already understood that the answers would not provide clarity. None of these changes were random. They were precise. They reflected a shift from engagement to observation, from openness to boundary. This is where silence begins to take on a different meaning, one that is often misread by those who expect communication to always remain verbal and explicit. Silence in this context is not the absence of thought or feeling. It is the result of having thought and felt enough to reach a conclusion that no longer requires external validation. There is a moment, and it does not always arrive all at once. When a person recognizes that, continuing to explain, to question, or to seek resolution is no longer productive because the pattern itself has already provided the answer. At that point, communication does not disappear. It changes form. It becomes selective. It becomes intentional. It becomes aligned with self-preservation rather than with maintaining connection at any cost. Boundaries emerge from this process in a way that is often invisible to the person who triggered them, because they are not always declared openly. They are enacted. They show up in what is no longer tolerated, in what is no longer pursued, in what is no longer given freely. A person may still be present in the interaction, still respond, still behave with a certain level of civility, but the depth of access has changed. What was once available is now restricted. What was once shared without hesitation is now filtered. This is not manipulation. It is adjustment. It is the mind and the nervous system recalibrating in response to a loss of trust, deciding, often without conscious language, that the previous level of openness is no longer safe or appropriate. There is a common mistake that occurs at this stage, and it comes from assuming that if there is no visible conflict, there is no significant problem. But the absence of confrontation does not indicate the presence of trust. In many cases, it indicates that trust has already been withdrawn to a degree that no longer justifies confrontation, because confrontation assumes there is something left to repair, something worth negotiating, something that can be restored through dialogue. When a person stops engaging at that level, it is often because they have moved past the stage where repair feels possible or meaningful. The dynamic has shifted from uncertainty to understanding, and understanding changes behavior in ways that do not always need to be explained. This is why silence in this context is not passive. It is not confusion. It is not avoidance. It is the visible expression of an internal decision that has already been made. Even if it has not yet been spoken aloud, the most dangerous mistake does not happen at the moment the lie is told. And it does not even happen when the lie is first sensed. It happens much later, in the quiet assumption that nothing fundamental has changed, that the relationship remains intact simply because it has not visibly ended. People begin to believe that empathy guarantees endurance, that understanding ensures continuation, that someone who has stayed through confusion, through inconsistency, through repeated misalignment will continue to stay, because that has become the established pattern. I have seen this assumption build slowly, almost invisibly, reinforced each time there is no immediate consequence. Each time the other person remains present, each time another chance is given without resistance. Over time, what was once appreciated becomes expected, and what was once seen as patience begins to be interpreted as permanence. This is where perception becomes distorted, because the absence of immediate loss is mistaken for the absence of risk. A person continues to engage, continues to speak, continues to offer a degree of connection, and this creates the illusion that nothing essential has been affected. But what is not being seen is the internal shift that often precedes any external change. Departure rarely begins with movement. It begins with recognition. It begins at the moment a person understands that what they are experiencing is not temporary, not accidental, but part of a consistent pattern that is unlikely to correct itself. That recognition does not always lead to immediate action. In fact, it often leads to a period of stillness where the person continues to observe, continues to confirm, continues to reconcile what they hoped was true with what is repeatedly being revealed. During that time, everything may appear unchanged on the surface, but internally, something is being recalibrated, expectations are lowered, emotional investment is reduced, the need to interpret generously begins to weaken. This is not a reaction driven by anger. It is a response driven by clarity, and clarity has a different quality than emotion. It is quieter, more stable, less reactive, but far more decisive once it fully forms, because once a pattern has been understood, it no longer needs to be debated. It no longer requires further evidence. It simply becomes the context through which every new interaction is interpreted. There is a particular moment in this process that is easy to miss if you are not paying close attention. And that is the moment when hope begins to withdraw, not collapse, not disappear abruptly, but withdraw, step by step, as the mind adjusts to the reality it has recognized. This is often when the greatest miscalculation occurs, because externally the person may still be present, still responsive, still functioning within the connection, and this presence is taken as confirmation that everything is recoverable. But presence is not the same as investment, and proximity is not the same as attachment. A person can remain physically or socially engaged while internally disengaging from the outcome. Even though it had been forming quietly for a long time, the explanation was always the same. There were no clear warnings. There was no final argument. There was no moment that signaled the end. But that interpretation overlooks the accumulation that preceded it, the repeated instances where something did not align, the gradual erosion of trust that was never fully acknowledged, the internal decisions that were made long before any external action followed. By the time the person chose to leave, they were not responding to a single event. They were responding to the pattern as a whole, to everything that had been seen, processed, and finally accepted. This is why the belief that someone will stay because they care deeply is so often misplaced. The capacity to care deeply is also the capacity to recognize when that care is no longer being held within something that respects it. And once that recognition becomes stable, it changes the cost of staying. What was once an act of patience begins to feel like an act of self-neglect. What was once interpreted as understanding begins to resemble tolerance of something that contradicts core values. At that point, the decision is no longer about preserving the relationship. It is about preserving internal coherence, about aligning behavior with what has been clearly understood. By the time that alignment is chosen, it rarely requires further discussion, not because there is nothing left to say, but because everything necessary has already been seen,